We have to, prepare for his careful extraction. We were given specific orders.
Last year, I played Doom 2016 and thought I would cover Doom Eternal soon after. Suffice to say, I got a bit distracted. I've finally gotten around to playing Eternal again, but this time with a critical eye and the recent-ish memories of 2016. This will actually be my second full playthrough of Eternal. I have not touched it since I beat it originally near launch in 2020. To preface the rest of this video, I have the following qualifier. I like Doom Eternal. I think it's a fun game. I think it's a very influential game. At the same time, it is a game with a lot of caveats. There are design choices in Eternal that I disagree with. I'm also not going to be touching the DLC in this video. Ancient Gods deserves to be separated from Eternal, and it knows why. So once more, shall we join an unholy union to rip and tear through the hordes of hell? But of course, I gotta talk about the development and real-world controversy first. Released March 20th, 2020, Doom Eternal is the product of the illustrious id Software. Details on the development of Doom Eternal are a bit scant, at least in comparison to the development nightmare that was Doom 2016. I'm assuming the game entered pre-production not long after the release of Doom 16. The first the world saw of Eternal was at E3 and QuakeCon 2018. It received the expected amount of fanfare when Hugo Martin and Marty Stratton stepped out onto the QuakeCon stage. I remember watching that presentation live and getting hyped with each passing minute. A lot of what they showed off ended up being a somewhat accurate representation of the game that would release 2 years later. That alone is fairly impressive. It also became very apparent this wasn't your dad's Doom. This was New Doom, and New Doom cranks the mobility to 13. The gameplay demo also showed off the PvP invasion system the campaign would feature. Other players would be able to invade your world as a demon. This would include the option to form a Slayer hunting party with another invader. It was also heavily implied that this Doom game was going to be lore heavy, effectively building upon the Doom cinematic universe. Personally, I don't know how much lore there is beyond Daisy, but there is the Tom Hall Doom Bible at id. After the fantastic presentation, Martin and Stratton sat down for interviews with various outlets. They answered some questions and clarified a few things, like how the Switch port would have a delayed release and there would be no deathmatch PvP. But we had our off-brand Predator gear and would be traveling to places never before seen, so that's nice. News would emerge over time and after release about what would happen next. The eventual release date for Doom Eternal was revealed to be November 22nd, 2019. Interestingly, Tim Willits would leave id Software in July of 2019, about 8 months prior to the release of Eternal. The game was eventually delayed to March 20th, 2020 alongside the PC port of Doom 64. And most people remember enough about 2020 that I don't need to elaborate there. What most people don't know is that it had been crunching for most of 2019 to meet that original November deadline. Both Stratton and Martin attempt to explain away the crunch. Stratton states in a VG 24/7 interview that, quote, "We were crunching pretty hard most of 2019. It goes in phases. We'll have one group of people crunching so the next group of people are teed up properly. As they get done, they may need to crunch a bit." Martin appeared on the Joe Rogan podcast and discussed how he finds himself working long hours without trying. Quote, "It's not really crunch. This is going to sound hokey. It's like a lifestyle. I live and breathe this. No one makes me stay at the office. Even when I come home, I see my kids, I do my thing, and then I just do research." Now look, crunch is a touchy subject because it requires people to sacrifice time for production. Some people live for that kind of thing. I myself tend to crunch to get these very videos out in a somewhat timely manner. I understand that sometimes crunch is an unfortunate necessity to finish a project, but not everyone lives to crunch. Some people want to see their kids instead of researching pop culture. I haven't seen any confirmations, but I'm willing to bet those additional months of development were filled with additional crunch. And that's shameful behavior from a studio as foundational to video games as id. Like, you can say that you're being respectful of people's time and lives, but if reality is showing something very different, then your words are meaningless. Eternal managed to garner more hype by releasing alongside Animal Crossing New Horizons. Something about the juxtaposition of the peak of Happy Good Feeling games and ultra-violence just mixes very well. Maybe that's why Freddy and Ban Ban do so well with the youth. Something of a concern on release was the noted absence of the invasion mode. It was assumed it would arrive in a post-release update. A blip on the radar, but things were looking alright for Eternal. But then came the soundtrack troubles. Bethesda had sold the soundtrack for Eternal as a pre-order bonus, but it was one that would release about a month after launch. Audiophiles confirmed what those with ears heard. The mixing of this album was different from Mick Gordon's previous work. Metadata shows that Chad Mossholder mixed most of the album. Nerds got mad and lashed out like they normally do with death threats and other bullshit. Stratton went as far as to make a post on the Doom subreddit to address the issue. It's full of corpo speak, but he effectively blamed Gordon for the resulting soundtrack, specifically stating that Gordon was given plenty of time to prepare the soundtrack, but only had 12 finished tracks by the album's release. The remainder were constructed using compressed game assets by Mossholder. Marty would later state that Gordon and id had gone their separate ways. Then, on the game's very first update post-launch, De Nouveau Anti-Cheat is added to the PC release. For those unfamiliar, De Nouveau is a series of complex DRM software prominently featured in AAA releases. Seemingly only a handful of people outside of the company are insane enough to understand how it works. I don't know, Piracy Lord is weird, man. TLDR, the software is very CPU intensive, which can make a big difference when trying to run a game on a toaster. Eternal will be the first title to feature De Nouveau's kernel-based anti-cheat system, and the first game to have it removed. Turns out, many computer nerds don't appreciate giving over total access to their machines to a third party. To many a privateer's delight, someone at id was not careful with their file management. When using the now-defunct Bethesda launcher, a DRM-less executable was included under a folder named Original. Privateers spread it online, and now Doom is truly eternal. Carmack be praised. Topically, De Nouveau was removed in September of this year by id. Really makes you wonder why they included it in the first place if they would remove it anyway 3 years later. A year post-release, and the invasion mode would be confirmed as canned by Stratton. He blamed the pandemic and remote work as the main reasons why the mode would be replaced with a Horde mode. But my bullshitterometer is spiking here. The mode had been hugely touted prior to launch, yet was absent on release. Eternal had been delayed prior to the existence of the virus. I'm willing to bet the demonic invasions had some kind of fundamental problem, be it networking, balancing, or just pure design. Whatever the problem, it, combined with others, were likely enough to need to delay the game, only to be scrapped later on when no longer feasible. A shame, but it happens. I would have preferred it if the developer had been straight with their consumers, but my investors. I will say that I am glossing over the rather exhaustive post-launch support that Eternal received. Next-gen console upgrades, the Switch port, tons of cosmetic DLC, seasonal events, empowered demons in the campaign, and not to mention the Ancient Gods DLC campaign. I said not today, you son of a bitch! Mid-2022, Mick Gordon would break his relative silence about the soundtrack in a blog post. I highly recommend you go read it for yourself to get a peek behind the curtain of working in video games, especially in regards to how contractors are paid for their work and how things can go very sideways. But keep in mind that this is a single person's perspective and may not be representative of the whole truth. Gordon was basically told to make music without ever being given any kind of real direction. He had to stick to a strict time schedule of providing 2 levels worth of songs per month. When Gordon brought up potential changes to the schedule to Marty, he made it clear he felt Gordon was simply incompetent rather than trying to facilitate production. Great start. Gordon made a ton of music as a part of the iterative process of game dev. Some work just has to be thrown away. Communication with id was sporadic at best, hostile at worst. The studio would constantly avoid approving music while prioritizing Gordon to produce more music. Eventually, old music would be rejected so more could be made within the budget. This practice resulted in Gordon going without pay for 11 months. By terms of his contract, he could only be paid for approved music. Gordon ended up creating double the amount of music allotted for in the budget. And according to Gordon, music that had been rejected was included in the game. Importantly, he was never given a contract for making an OST until days before Eternal's launch. Meanwhile, it had been selling expensive collector's editions that touted Mick Gordon's Doom Eternal original soundtrack, a rather large consumer protections oversight. Gordon had to go above Marty to Bethesda to get the OST issue resolved. He had actually experienced similar tomfoolery when making the OST for another Bethesda game. He made it, the OST was never released, and Gordon was never paid for his work. It is heavily implied that the game in question is Wolfenstein: The Old Blood, seeing as that's the only Bethesda game he was involved in that year. The OST contracting process took 9 months, partly because Bethesda started selling that old OST and Gordon wanted to get paid for his work. When all was said and done, it was 2 days before the game's release, leaving almost no time for music production. Gordon had 29 days to produce 12 tracks as agreed upon in the contract. 13 days prior to delivery, Marty became involved. According to him, the previously flexible due date was now inflexible due to consumer protection laws. He also implied that Gordon would be legally liable for any losses resulting from his inability to deliver. At that point, Marty also unveiled that Chad Mossholder had been stitching together a soundtrack version, literally, and for several months if the metadata is to be believed. After some petty bickering over a 4 to 5 hour time extension at the 11th hour, Marty decided to go with Mossholder's version of the album with Gordon's tracks interspersed, and the result is the official Doom Eternal soundtrack. Now look, there are allegations of a settlement to take blame for the soundtrack's inconsistencies and basically absolve Marty of any wrongdoing from the post on Reddit. I'm not going to get into that part because the lawyers might still be actively involved and I don't want to take a stray legal bullet in the crossfire. Bethesda wrote a pretty boilerplate response on the website previously known as Twitter. They had evidence to the contrary and discouraged harassment of all parties. Since then, there has been effective radio silence on the issue 10 months later. I am sure lawyers are still involved and delaying as usual. It's a shame, really, that such a talented composer could be driven away from working with a legendary studio like id. And it's clearly not an institutional problem, because in that blog post, Gordon states that he does have great relations with people at id, but sometimes people don't mesh. Mick Gordon and Marty Stratton clearly did not. With the history of Doom Eternal now laid out, I guess now is as good a time as any to explain my thought processes on reviews. The purpose of reviewing a game prior to or near release is the justification of hype. Should you be excited to spend your time and money on this new release? Or does it fall short of the reviewer's arbitrary expectations? Looking at you, Ryan McCaffrey, with your Alien Isolation review for IGN, makes me a bit less confident in your review for Doom Eternal. My point is, few people can take a real critical look at a game in a single work week, or less. It is easier to rely upon emotion and a list of talking points rather than to try to really explain core mechanics or design problems. I like to take my time to try and avoid this problem. That's why these videos take months to produce. I am currently writing something that likely won't be posted until the end of September at best. On that note, there will almost never be a J-Files episode on a game that is under 2 to 3 years old. It may seem counterintuitive to review a long-release product, but Doom Eternal is the perfect example. We knew some of the soundtrack shenanigans in 2020. The full story did not reveal itself until over 2 years post-release. An entire feature was only confirmed to be cut from the game after it had been on shelves for a year. There has to be time for interviews, for people to generally form their own opinions, for excitement to die down, and for memories to form. I am not chasing hype. I'm trying to discern reality here. Alright, I've had about enough of talking around Eternal. I want to actually look at the game. Visually, Doom Eternal looks great. I don't think anyone will say that these insanely detailed environments, weapons, and demons are objectively terrible. Distant background objects are all helping to convey what happened in this world. Urdak is one of the prettiest places I have ever seen. The gore is on an entirely new level because these demons are like ogres. They have layers to peel away. Each demon seems to have a skin, muscle, and bone layer combined with location-based damage, meaning that an enemy can have a messed up head or limb but look mostly fine otherwise. However, the devil is in the details, or in this case, the comparisons. Doom Eternal may look amazing in a vacuum, but in my opinion, it loses some of that luster when compared to its direct predecessor. Whereas Doom 2016 had this semi-realistic and dull color pattern akin to Doom 3, Eternal leans more into the cartoony color tones of the first two Doom games. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. Leaning in helps to give Eternal its own visual identity as a mix of old and new, a theme that carries throughout almost every aspect of the game. Which leads me to the redesigns. Many of the enemies from 2016 have been altered to look more in line with the original sprites. Bog standard zombies replaced the possessed, the imp got some horns, soldiers have lost their armor, you can see the Hell Knight's eyes for some reason, the Revenant has gone from pants-shittingly terrifying to a bony doofus. Personally, the only redesigns that actually look better than the 2016 versions are the Mancubus and the Hell Baron. These enemy redesigns, in combination with pickup redesigns, come off as pandering to the audience rather than melding the visual styles of two different eras of gaming. And that's also a bit of a theme that carries through Eternal. It seems like the developers were hesitant to turn people away from their gory demon slaughtering simulator and tried to overcompensate in some ways. On the performance side of things, Eternal's a bit of a hog. Of course, it is a newer game, but one that was made with the 8th generation consoles in mind. So I was a little bit surprised when my computer had trouble playing and recording the game at the same time. No matter what I did, OBS's video encoder would become overloaded when the action became hectic enough. And yeah, I could have lowered the video settings, but truthfully, I don't want to show off this game at lower than high settings. I feel like it's a bit of an injustice at that point. Something notable for me was the one time the game crashed. It happened in almost the exact same manner as the single crash I encountered in 2016. When trying to use the weapon wheel under some very specific conditions that I don't understand, the game will soft crash. I haven't tried replicating it, but seeing as I've managed to encounter it across 2 games, I'm confident I could figure out a way. Thankfully, the soundtrack manages to distract me from more nitpicking. Mick Gordon manages to outdo himself with the music. Somehow, he managed to make a more insane electro metal score. He used a chainsaw as one of the main instruments in a song. Words are not enough to describe the wall of sound that is music. So I'll just let it do the talking for itself. And that's just a selection of my favorite tracks. Despite the mixing issues, the core of that 59-song album is great. The soundtrack helps to reinforce that theme of melding old and new. The very first piece of music in the campaign, called SOS from Earth on the official soundtrack, features a slow build-up to a redux of At Doom's Gate from 2016, which in turn is an homage to OG Doom's E1M1 theme. Gordon managed to perfect perfection with his work in Doom Eternal. The madman held a metal choir so we could get deep demon chanting. Aside from the music, the audio engineers once again go above and beyond. Demons are meaty coming apart. Gunshots provide that necessary feedback to make weapons feel more powerful. My personal favorite in that regard is the heavy cannon. It sounds like I'm firing 50 caliber bullets into demons' faces. The active adaptation of the music returns in Eternal to my delight, meaning that the tracks will reflect what you are doing in the game, essentially turning the demonic slaughter into a symphony of destruction. The voice acting is quite the delight as well. The few humans you encounter are sufficiently hammed up. The demonic priests are cartoonishly evil sounding. Nika Futterman's performance as the con maker stood out from the rest. She sounds so serene at the beginning of the campaign, only to devolve into barely contained rage and madness by the end. Presentation aside, slaying demons is really why many of us have flocked to Eternal. And boy does this game not disappoint on the gameplay side. Just in a slightly different way than most people were expecting. Whereas 2016 could be considered wholesale power fantasy slaughter, Eternal requires the player to think more strategically. There are a lot of different resources to use during combat, to the point that the game feels it needs to put indicators in your line of vision so you know when certain abilities are off cooldown. The chainsaw still causes demons to explode into ammunition. Ripping enemies apart with your hands will provide health. A new flamethrower will cause enemies to drop armor. Grenades have been rethought from 2016 with a standard fragmentation and new cryobomb options. There's even a one-hit kill sword that you require in the back half of the campaign. And I haven't even gotten to the new dash mechanic. The agility that the Slayer displays is closer to something like Titanfall than Doom. I think that the emphasis on mobility is the most influential part of Eternal. The number of mobility-focused shooters has only increased in the years since. Eternal continually adds more complexity and cooldowns with each passing minute. Some consider this mechanical bloat. I sympathize with that in some ways. A lot of mechanics are thrown at the player throughout the course of the campaign. Frankly, I could have done with just the frag grenade or the cryobomb. Further adding to the need for strategic thinking are the existence of enemy weak points. Players will need to learn enemy weaknesses to maximize damage. Case in point, the Cacodemon. These poor guys are screwed from the beginning since the shotgun's grenade mod hard counters them. If you play with tutorials on, these weaknesses will be spoon-fed to you. Gameplay will stop so Eternal can hold your hand on how to defeat a demon. While you can play without tutorials, the increased mechanical complexity requires their use on a first playthrough. I feel like this is indicative of an overreaction by id. In an interview prior to release, Stratton points to a Polygon video about Doom 2016 where the person playing seemed to not be very familiar with how FPS games worked. Combine this with the constant signposting that stops gameplay, and it's indicative that Doom Eternal was meant to garner wider appeal. Not necessarily a bad thing, but it also feels inconsistent with the increased mechanical complexity I've described. Eternal tries to lower the skill floor while raising the skill ceiling. For me, that doesn't work. Instead, id's attempts are a constant source of annoyance while playing the campaign. Thankfully, the combat itself is enough to carry Doom Eternal into the mesosphere, but it is worth noting that these problems exist. The weapon roster this time around is similar to that of 2016 with some noted additions and subtractions. Say goodbye to the pistola and say hello to the shotgun as the newest weakest weapon in the game. Honestly, I think this might be the singular best weapon roster change I've seen in an FPS. Dinky hand cannons are not going to be enough for what the Slayer has to fight. Though it is worth noting the pistol is in the game, you just need console commands to access it. Otherwise, the roster is very similar to 2016 with the shotgun, heavy cannon, plasma rifle, rocket launcher, super shotgun with meat hook, chain gun, and the BFG 9000. The Gauss cannon has been replaced with the functionally identical ballistic cannon. New weapon mods are really the only difference. The Unmaker returns from Doom 64 as an unlockable weapon that can replace the BFG. It's fine, but I had more fun acquiring the weapon than I did using it. Unlocking the Unmaker requires the player to unlock and complete all 6 Slayer gates in the game. Slayer gates are challenge rooms where you must defeat all enemies inside without dying or be forced to restart. These can prove to be quite the challenge, especially once the rooms start spawning demons the player has not fought yet. One major complaint about the weapons is the ammo counts per weapon. Almost everyone I have heard discuss Eternal hates the low ammo limits. The game starts the player off with a maximum of 16 shells for the shotgun. Thankfully, this can be upgraded to a total of 24 shells? I only get 50% more ammo for all my weapons? What the fuck, id? That's some bullshit right there. As far as I know, the stated intent behind limiting the ammo counts was to encourage players to switch weapons. I call bullshit because I already did that in Doom 2016. If I want to use the super shotgun through the entire game like I did in 2016, I will. You can't stop me, even if you try nerfing the weapon into the ground. One of the main points of contention around Doom 2016 was the series of superfluous systems added on top of the gameplay. You know, the gun mods, suit upgrades, challenge runes. Well, it decided to ignore all criticism and double down on systems. Like last time, the player has weapon modifications that are improved with weapon points earned by slaughtering demons. Each weapon has a mastery challenge that leads to an even more powerful upgrade. Only this time, it decided that these challenges should be skippable through the use of these coins. Suit upgrades are coins earned by Ghost Sentinels. The upgrade wheel applies to your mobility, your 2 kinds of upgrades, auto map shenanigans, and environmental hazards. I actually think this is a good change in general because it puts all of this type of upgrade on a single screen. Runes return, but thankfully there are no challenges associated with their acquisition. I don't really like any of the new additions, so I ended up using my tried and true runes that return from 2016. Air mobility and glory kill speed are necessities in my book. Increasing the distance in which I can rip demons apart is also very appreciated. Slowing down time in midair seems pretty mid to me. Sentinel batteries unlock different parts of the orbital obelisk. This results in different costumes and upgrades becoming available to the player. Oh man, I almost forgot to talk about the actual health and ammo upgrades. By smashing these crystals, you can upgrade ammo, health, and armor capacity. Additionally, these upgrades can unlock more upgrades if you choose 2 of the same upgrade slot. I'm pretty sure one of them upgrades your Flame Belch, but I could be mixing them up with another upgrade elsewhere. This is the problem with having so many systems. Eventually you just forget something is a thing and just do what works. I briefly talked about the demons in the visual sections, but it is worth noting that almost every demon from 2016 makes a return in Eternal. The Summoner and Hellraiser were left out of the fun. Losing the Summoner makes sense as the Archvile makes his fiery return. If I see an Archvile, I beeline straight for them. Archviles are enemy number 1 followed by the buff totems. These totems effectively power up all demons in an area to a rather absurd extent. At least a single stomp will destroy them. Aside from some other returning faces like the Pain Elemental and the Arachnotron, Doom Eternal has a large roster of new demons to rip apart. Prowlers are essentially trans-dimensional imps with more health. They're pretty easy to kill as long as you don't lose track of them. I originally thought they were unique to Eternal, but a quick Google search tells me that they were originally a playable demon in the Doom 2016 multiplayer mode. Never saw them myself, but that mode was also fairly dead when I played it for the video. On that note, there's the Gargoyle, a flying imp, and a mecha zombie to round out the fodder. The tentacles can go fuck themselves. They're my absolute least favorite enemy, popping up out of the ground just to slap the Slayer in the face. You have to know they are coming or have incredible reaction times to prevent yourself from getting hit by the tentacles. Plus, they are often used in conjunction with the purple no fun floors. These floors prevent the player from running, jumping, and dashing. Hence, no fun. I'm honestly not sure why these floors were included in the game beyond purposefully frustrating players. My favorite bit of tonal whiplash in Eternal comes from a segment fairly early on involving these floors. Intense music is playing and I'm slowly walking along the no fun floor. It's just plain goofy. The Carcass is a weird enemy, one that I actually really like in both design and function. They waddle along on their tripod, placing energy shields to protect their fellow demons. Thankfully, shields in Eternal explode when overcharged by energy weapons. The Whiplash is my kryptonite. These slithery schmucks are tankier than you would think. An average of 3 to 4 rockets are required to exterminate one of these guys. Additionally, Whiplashes are hard to hit because of their speed and body shape. Combine those characteristics with the ability to hit like a truck, and the Whiplash becomes a surprisingly difficult enemy. This room in the cultist base where you first encounter them is what I consider to be the difficulty wall in Eternal. If you can't get beyond it, lower the difficulty. Eternal will only become more intense from that point on. Dread Knights are cybernetically enhanced Hell Knights with 2 energy swords. On top of everything a Hell Knight can do, the Dread Knight has a ranged attack. No amount of distance you put between yourself and this demon will make you safe. Consider them a priority target. Doom Hunters are a boss type enemy that becomes more of a mid-boss later in the game. These guys are a 2-stage enemy where the first stage is far more dangerous than the second. A flying torso is a bit harder to hit, but he doesn't have missiles or shields. The Marauder is perhaps the most infamous enemy in Eternal. Many a player's day has been ruined by these demonic Night Sentinels. Their shields block all damage, and they summon not so good boys to harass you. Their axes fire energy blasts, and their super shotguns give me flashbacks to Gascoigne from Bloodborne. Thankfully, Marauders will telegraph their melee attacks with a green flash of their eyes. Blast him with the super shotgun to stun him, and follow up with a shot from the ballista. Repeat until beaten. Finally, we get to the big boy. The kind of demon that has hunted you since 92. Well, really 93, but 92 rhyme better. The legend himself. The Tyrant? But he looks exactly like the Cyber Demon. Are you saying there can only be one Cyber Demon and it was this chump? Nah, that's a Cyber Demon despite whatever psyop id is attempting to pull on the community. He even turns slow like a Cyber Demon. Avoid his missiles and fill him full of lead. Or just use the Crucible to humiliate the Cyber Demon. There are a couple of proper bosses to be encountered, but they will have to stick behind spoiler tags. I would say 2 are hits, and the third is a half miss. Enhanced demons will occasionally spawn to provide a new challenge to the player. They basically have more health and damage. But EDs will explode into ammo confetti upon death. Enhanced demons are id's solution to the invasion mode not panning out the way they had hoped. Personally, I think they're a welcome addition. They add that extra bit of challenge for a returning player. Beyond the basics of the gameplay, there are 3 modes to play in Doom Eternal. A story attempts to assert itself this time, so the campaign will have to stick behind the spoilers section, but Battlemode and Horde are fair game for now. Battlemode is a 2v1 multiplayer mode where the Slayer must fight 2 player-controlled demons in a best of 5 rounds. The Slayer controls as one would expect, albeit parts of the Slayer's kit become unlocked over the course of the match. There are a total of 6 playable demons in Battlemode. Demons each have their own unique abilities, strategies, and heck, their mobility is drastically different from each other. At the end of each round, a player can pick from a wheel of upgrades to improve their character or their abilities. This applies to both the Slayer and the demons. Having played Battlemode, I can understand why invasions were removed from the campaign. Battlemode is fun for demons and stressful for Slayers. Having to fight a 2v1 against other players while they summon other demons is a real challenge. Dropping an invasion into the campaign of a player who may already be struggling would be an absolute motivation killer. Match stability is also non-existent. I had people either quitting before a match began or connections were just dropping all over the place. There was one time I had to fight a Slayer by myself because the other demon dropped right as the match began. I spent almost as much time looking for a match as I did playing my matches. It's not like there aren't people playing Eternal, but I guess most of them aren't playing this underwhelming multiplayer mode. Between Battlemode and 2016's multiplayer, I don't quite understand why it is so hard for id to simply make a deathmatch multiplayer and leave it at that. 90% of the players are playing for the campaign anyway, although some of them might have been playing the Horde mode. Horde mode recommends that you actually play the campaign and DLC before attempting it. Honestly, that's a very wise idea. DLC enemies and some of the hardest, most prolonged fights in Eternal exist in Horde mode. The name is a tad misleading as well. It's not so much a classic Horde mode a la Gears of War as it is a series of challenges and arenas. You have a score in the top right of your screen that will increase with every demon killed. Some kind of demonic Hunger Games cannon will sound as well. You keep going until you die, and extra lives can be earned to further your progress. Without the extra lives, I would not have managed to get to mission 2 of 3. Your score is posted on a leaderboard, but I've honestly never cared about those kinds of things. Something funny to consider is the better the player performs, the more they will have to fight. Certain demons will spawn in the arena mode that must be killed within a time limit. Doing so will unlock the bonus rounds and spawn a score multiplier. These bonus rounds are significantly longer and more difficult than the standard 2 rounds per arena. Overall, these additional modes are both a hit and a miss. Battle mode is stressful in a bad way. It's not very fun to play despite the genuine interest I had in the mode starting out. Horde mode is a fantastic addition that adds a bit of a challenge for those who thought Eternal was too easy. Those master levels are already quite the challenge for me. Oh shit, I forgot about the master levels. These are remixes of levels in the main campaign that are meant to be a significant challenge. Truthfully, yeah, they are tough, but not built Horde tough. Doom Eternal's story is the exact opposite of 2016 in nearly every way. Eternal is bombastic in your face with how much lore there is to Doom. I mean, the use of cutscenes is a great example. Almost every single level of Eternal has multiple cutscenes. Eternal is trying to build a world and narrative where there needs to be none. It feels like such total whiplash when compared to Doom 2016, which could have given less of a shit about a greater story. Additionally, I can recall 4 occasions where the control was taken away from the player in 2016. That contrasts with Eternal, where it happens at least once per level. Like the last time around, there is a significant amount of lore to read. In 2016, these lore entries were UAC documents, whereas in Eternal, they are more like unholy scripture. It's the first in many of a decision to really lean into that kind of irony of the situation in Eternal. Eternal knows it's doing some ridiculous shit. The infamous hole in Mars line is enough to prove that point. Unfortunately, leaning into that irony comes off as a bit disingenuous to me. There's something different in how the narrative treats the Slayer between Eternal and 2016. I can't quite nail down if it's the tone or content, but Eternal's glorification of the Slayer is a step too far. He's not God. I don't even think he likes humanity that much. He just wants revenge for Daisy. Doom Eternal can feel fragmented and abrupt at times due to the trans-dimensional nature of the story. One moment you'll be fighting hordes on a demonic ravaged Earth before teleporting to a Sentinel planet for a MacGuffin. Then it's back to the pits of hell to do a swapsies with some trustworthy man. Each level feels wildly disconnected from one another, especially when the player barely understands what they are doing and why. It's not until Hayden returns that we begin to have an understanding of what is going on. Alright, I'm ranting and getting too close to spoiler territory. If you care about Doom Eternal spoilers, I suggest you skip to the time on screen because I have a bit to go over.
Ain't nothing like a phone gimme.
Eternal feels tangentially related to Doom 2016 in terms of story. It begins with the Slayer listening to the pleas of demonic invasion survivors from his Fortress of Doomitude. There is no explanation for how and why you have your own League watchtower, nor any description for what the Slayer has been doing in the time between games. Instead, you teleport to hell knows where for a tutorial section that ends with a Hell Priest being undone. Apparently, the Slayer defeated his boss demon off screen. Our Slayer then hops off a Hell Barge and thunders his way to where the remaining Hell Priests are located. They're in the middle of a meeting with the big con maker who tells the Slayer off for interfering with the grand design. I'm going to be skipping around the story, so just assume that in between every story beat, there's at least one horde of demons to mulch. In order to triangulate on the next Hell Priest, the Slayer visits a dead Sentinel world to grab the MacGuffin I described earlier. While grabbing it, Ghost Daddy Sentinel gives the Slayer a warning. Humanity are not his people to save anymore, and actions will have consequences. Blah blah blah, he disappears from the story. The Slayer then travels to somewhere in hell to charge his new MacGuffin with the Betrayer. According to the lore, the Betrayer is the one who let the demons into Argent from the last game, in return for the resurrection of his son. Only his son was resurrected as the Icon of Sin, Monkey's Paw. The Betrayer has some lines about how now is the time of humanity's penance before tossing you Chekhov's knife. MacGuffin charge, the Slayer attacks a cultist base in the Arctic housing the second priest. Here, the Hell Priest reveals he has unearthed the remains of a species of demonic hunters. They apparently roamed Earth forever ago, but were wiped out during the Metal Age. Anyway, these corpses are being juiced up and attached to anti-gravity tanks as an anti-Slayer upgrade. Too bad it doesn't work out for the first guy. The remaining team members perform a tag team match at Hell in the Cell as retribution. Our Slayer retains his belt before leaving it on the body of the second priest, furthering his feud with the Demonic Federation. Back home, the Maker is a Colin. She is not happy with the Slayer's actions. The remaining Hell Priest has been hidden away to ensure the fall of Earth. Notably, the Conmaker states her actions are for the survival of her own race. We will come back to that. For now, the Slayer needs to shut down the Super Gore Nest. But first, a note from the UAC. Corporate would like to remind everyone that demon can be an offensive term. They prefer to be called mortally challenged or brimstone brethren. So please, submit to them. Where was I? Oh yeah, Gore Nest go boom and fewer demons able to get to Earth. Now it's time to find that motherfucker Hayden who took my crucible. What is left of him is located at the Ark Complex, headquarters of the human resistance. Judging by all the broken mechs, lava rivers, and piles of skulls I stand upon, I'd say that Hayden could improve in a few places. In this mission, you can find logs of a scientist slowly transforming from Slayer Skeptic to Slayer Sycophant. Enter the Ark Complex, and the Slayer comes face to face with normal people. I love how regular humanity and the Doomslayer interact. Like, people are clearly amazed by him, but also don't quite know how to deal with him. The Crucible returns to its rightful owner and we find Hayden in suspension, and it will require a delicate hand to transport him back to the Watchtower. Enter the Marauder. Marauders are such a metal enemy from a lore standpoint. See, the Night Sentinels are still around in a way, it's just that most of the remaining living members have sided with the Conmaker and the demons. The remainder were scattered during the Night of Broken Argent. These Marauders are the resurrected members of the Slayer's personal squad of Sentinels who have been infused with demonic energy. You were never one of us hits much differently when you know the context behind who is saying it. It's one of those few aspects that I wish it had been actually more in our face about the story. Marauder mauled, the Slayer returns to the fortress and hooks Hayden up to the base. His mind transfers and Hayden is now the ghost of the machine. Hayden knows the Slayer well and wastes no time dropping facts. He pinpoints the location of the final Hell Priest to Sentinel Prime. Problem is, the only functional Stargate is located in the lost city of Hebeth, inside the core of Mars. Not sure how it is a lost city when you know its location. In any case, getting to the core of Mars will be a difficult proposition. That is, unless you want to misappropriate a orbital cannon by the name of the Big Fucking Gun 10,000. Cue the line everybody knows.
You can't just shoot a hole into the surface of Mars.
The E3 demo will then begin to play in front of you. I can see why they would want to show off this segment to the world first. It is one of my favorite parts of Eternal. The way the Slayer just barely doesn't strangle the key holder and takes a gun from a security guard is simply wonderful. No words are needed. I will go where I please. After slicing through the facility, the Slayer proceeds to blow a massive hole in the side of Mars. Oddly enough, an escape pod is the Slayer's only means of entry into Mars's core. Past a few demons and lava pits, the Slayer arrives in Sentinel Prime for an exposition dump. Most of it is contained in some codex entries and cutscenes explaining how the Slayer is OG Doom Guy. He fell into the Sentinel dimension sometime after Doom 64 and met the Sentinel civilization. Apparently no one had ever heard of demons prior to Doom Guy's ramblings. Doom Guy joined the Night Sentinels to fulfill his rip and tear requirements for the Slayer class. Throughout this plot dump, the Conmaker is singing the Slayer's praises and offering platitudes. She pities humanity and the role they must serve. But without Hell energy, there is no Argent, and Urdak needs Argent. The Conmaker even offers to the Slayer what he lost long ago, and the only thing that comes to mind is a certain bunny. But I've had enough of lore for now. It's time for the first actual boss fight of the game. The Gladiator is a shield-toting demon who sheds said shield after the first stage. And boy am I glad it does. The first stage of this boss is tedious. The Gladiator behaves like a much bigger and stronger Marauder with a shorter window of opportunity for attack. This battle requires patience that Eternal has otherwise discouraged. There's always been some other mechanic or weapon I could use, but not here. Only one solution, and it kinda blows. However, the second half of this boss fight makes up in part for the first. The shield is stabbed and the gladiator draws another mace to go two-handed. He also sends these waves of energy at the player. I have always seen it as a nod to Gordon and the sine waves used as the core of the new Doom soundtracks. Speaking of, the Gladiator boss theme is my favorite track on the entire soundtrack. Funny enough, the chant you hear is the crowd going rip and tear in the demonic language. They are cheering on the Slayer and not the demon. I love it so much. Anyway, the big guy goes down, which makes the priest vulnerable. However, the priest is a holy man and no holy blood must be shed on these sacred sentinel grounds. I don't know, it's some kind of rules ex machina that causes the Slayer to lose all sovereignty and titles of the sentinels when the Slayer inevitably blasts him. Other sentinels are mad, so the Slayer pieces out to the Watchtower of Despair. The Con Maker is no longer playing around and has taken control of your citadel in space. She intends to make it the Slayer's prison where he can watch the world burn as she unleashes the Icon of Sin. You then have what is a fairly disappointing battle with bottom tier demons in the control room of your tower. I wish there had been at least a Hell Knight or a Mancubus to at least spice up the encounter. In any case, the Slayer retakes control of his ship with the use of the reclaimed Crucible. It also has the side effect of turning on the red filter. Great aesthetic touch. The Slayer travels to a part of Argent Denor that isn't a hellscape like the final part of Doom 2016 to reclaim his sword for the upcoming battle. Only if he removes his sword, it'll unleash the Titan it is currently containing. So the Slayer makes the logical choice to break the energy sword from the handle. Using the handle and a red coin, he forges a new blade by dunking it in this pool of Argent energy. Eternal just keeps throwing bits of lore at the player without ever truly explaining everything. I honestly can't tell if I love that or hate it. Oh, it is also in this level where we get a flashback to when the Seraphim upgrades Doom Guy into the Doom Slayer with his cheat engine. Anyway, it's off to the endgame with a download of Vega. Lot of exposition by Samuel Hayden through the next couple of levels. The first two levels take place in the unholy tower of Necroval. Hell energy is processed there and sent across dimensions to Urdak, home of the Makers. Urdak is slowly dying, and to prevent the end of her people, the Con Maker made a deal with the devil. Literally. Hell gets human souls, they are used to produce Argent energy, and a portion is sent off to Urdak. Interestingly, when a soul has been removed from a human, the husk of their body becomes a demon. There's a fight with demonic Anubis, aka just a giant brain. Also, a shit ton of demons get unalived in the process of climbing the tower. Once at the top, the Slayer rides the energy beam to heaven. Urdak is striking to look at. It is visually different from pretty much everything in the series up to this point. Urdak is an untainted island in a sea of defilement. The Slayer arrives just as the Maker is finishing upgrading the Icon of Sin. Her cronies are praying over a beating heart that I assume gives control over the Icon of Sin. Thus, Chekhov's knife makes its triumphant return to sever control over the Icon. He thanks the Slayer for his freedom by walking through an open portal to Earth. Having completed his side quest, the Slayer must now reassemble a portal to send him to Earth. Unfortunately for the Makers, the Slayer entering Urdak broke some kind of trans-dimensional seal. Demons can now enter Urdak, so the alliance between dimensions quickly breaks down in the face of new lands to corrupt. While the Slayer trounces around Urdak, there are some notable bits of lore that arise. Makers are a sort of hive mind race that follows the will of their Con. The Con Maker rules for 10,000 years before being reabsorbed by the Singularity, which is the collective soul consciousness of every important Maker ever. It is also the device which links all Makers to the Con. The Makers also had a father figure who kept things stable and running. That was until he went out for cigarettes and never returned. Doing so caused the cycle to be disrupted, signaling the end of the Makers. Additionally, no more Con Makers could be created either, leaving the current Con to rule for effectively eternity. There's also this massive Maker floating in an Eva tank that I don't quite understand. Maybe this is the body of the father, but does that mean the soul is missing? That seems to be the case because when the Slayer uploads Vega onto the computer systems, he has a realization. Vega is the father. No time to think of the implications, it's time to get back to Earth to stop the Icon of Sin. But first, the Con Maker would like to have a word or two about how the Slayer destroyed her people. This devolves into a really easy boss fight. Blaster with a ballista, get the shield down, meat hook, blood punch, repeat. At least the Icon of Sin is a much more entertaining fight. It's a two-stager where you must target specific sections of the Icon to damage him. First you need to remove his armor, then his skin. All while the Icon is summoning flames, punching the Slayer, and generally looking like what many people imagined back in the days of Doom 2. Great fight. forces you to think strategically and rely upon everything the game has taught you up until this point. Even if this fight is a tad gimmicky with the locational damage. It ends in a brutal cutscene where the Slayer stabs the icon in the skull with his blade before breaking it off and sealing the demonic titan once more. With the icon of sin defeated, King Novak narrates the epilogue. The battle has been won, but this war is eternal for the Slayer. The story continues in the Ancient Gods Part 1 and 2, and that's a video for another day. This script is already one of the longest I've ever written, and I don't feel like making an hour-long video that I think would waste people's time. Oops. I think the base storyline of Doom Eternal has some great moments. I think the idea of heaven becoming corrupted into taking a deal with the devil is a fantastic concept. Nate recommends reading the Sandman Slim novels if you're interested in that kind of thing. I also very much enjoyed the lore for the makers in particular. However, there were some definite points that felt incredibly disconnected from the larger narrative. As much as I liked the E3 presentation from earlier, I have a sneaking suspicion that was originally much earlier in the game and where you would require the plasma rifle. But hey, I'm going off nothing but my own brain here, so take it with enough salt to kill 12 slugs. In the end, Doom Eternal is a great but flawed shooter that tries to follow up the solid base design of 2016 with an unfortunate amount of bloat. Eternal itself is a ton of fun and a technical marvel in some ways. But in a lot of others, there are an unnecessary amount of extraneous mechanics. The bloat combined with my other annoyances are ultimately more of what I remember about Eternal than the fun I had playing it. After having reviewed both games now, I have to say that I ultimately prefer Doom 2016 to Eternal. The design felt tighter and required less strategic thinking. Not to say that I don't like strategy in my games, but sometimes I just want to throw on the demon-killing catharsis machine and not have to use my brain. Doom Eternal is $39.99 on Steam, and I would encourage you to get this one on sale. You could buy 2 whole Doom 2016s or a Bomb Rush Cyberpunk for that same price. Spend your money wisely, kids. Thanks for watching. More garbage to come.
Coleman.